Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It's 40,000 years ago. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. You're sitting at the mouth of a cave, somewhere in what will one day be called France. The air is cooling fast, that sharp cold that comes when there's no city lights, no heated buildings, nothing between you and the raw night except stone and fire. In front of you, flames crackle and dance. The fire pit is carefully built, stones arranged in a circle, the result of knowledge passed down through countless generations. Around you sit maybe 15 other people, a mother nursing an infant, 2 men sharpening spear points with incredible precision, an older woman weaving plant fibres into something useful, children playing a game with pebbles, their laughter echoing off the cave walls. This is home, this is family, this is life. But here's the question that brings you here tonight. What was life actually like for these people? Not the cartoons you saw as a kid, not the grunting, club-wielding brutes from the movies, the real people, the ones who looked up at the same stars you do, who felt love and fear and joy, who created art that still takes our breath away when we discover it painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years later. We call them cavemen. We make jokes about dragging women by their hair, about being primitive, about living in some kind of brutish ignorance. But that image? It's almost completely wrong. And the truth, the actual truth about how our prehistoric ancestors lived, is so much more fascinating than any Hollywood stereotype. See, when archaeologists started digging into our ancient past, what they found wasn't simplicity. They found complexity. They found innovation. They found human beings who were just as intelligent as we are, facing a world far more dangerous than anything we can imagine, and not just surviving, but thriving, creating, building communities that lasted for thousands of years, developing technology so effective we're still trying to figure out how they made them. Think about it this way. If you were dropped into the world of 40,000 years ago with nothing but the clothes on your back, how long would you last? A day? A week? You'd have no idea which plants are poisonous. You wouldn't know how to track game. You couldn't make fire from scratch. You'd freeze or starve or become dinner for something with bigger teeth than you. But they lived there. They raised children there. They created music and art and spiritual practices. They cared for their elderly and their sick. They buried their dead with ceremony and what looks an awful lot like love. Tonight, we're going on a journey together. A journey back through time to understand what life was really like for the average person living in the Paleolithic era. Not the heroes, not the chiefs, just regular people trying to make it through another day in a world that wanted to kill them at every turn. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and do me a favor, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at midnight, London at lunch, Sydney at sunrise, all experiencing this story at the same moment across time zones. We're going to explore the shelters they built and where they actually spent their time. Spoiler, it wasn't always in caves. We'll hunt with them, forage with them, learn about the incredible tools they invented. We'll sit around their fires and understand their families, their communities, the bonds that held them together when the world was trying to tear them apart. We'll discover their art, paintings and carvings so beautiful they make modern museum visitors weep. We'll learn about their health, their medicine, how they dealt with injury and illness without hospitals or pharmacies, and we'll spend a day with them, dawn to dusk, experiencing every moment of what it meant to be human before civilization, before agriculture, before everything we think makes us modern. But here's what makes this journey so powerful. These weren't aliens. They weren't a different species living in some incomprehensible way. They were us. Genetically, cognitively, emotionally, They were identical to people walking around today. Same brain size, same capacity for language, same ability to think and feel and dream. The only difference: they lived in a time when survival wasn't guaranteed, when every day was a test, when knowledge meant the difference between life and death, and that knowledge had to be carried in memory, passed down through stories and demonstrations, because there was no writing, no books, no Google to back you up, and they passed the test. For tens of thousands of years, through ice ages and warming periods, through megafauna extinctions and climate upheavals, they survived. They adapted. They innovated. They became us. So let's go back. Back to that fire at the cave mouth. Back to a time when the night was truly dark and truly dangerous, and the only thing keeping the darkness at bay was firelight, community, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who refused to give up. Let's find out what life was really like for the average caveman. Let's start with a truth that might surprise you. The word caveman is basically a lie. Not completely false, but misleading enough that it's worth unpacking before we go any further. When you hear caveman, you probably picture some hairy brute huddled in a dark cave, grunting at his family while gnawing on a mammoth bone. Pop culture has done this to us. Cartoons, movies, museum dioramas, they've all hammered this image into our collective consciousness until it feels like historical fact. But here's what the archaeological evidence actually tells us. Most prehistoric humans didn't live in caves. They couldn't. There aren't enough caves. Do the math. At any given time during the late Pleistocene, there were probably hundreds of thousands of humans spread across 3 continents: Africa, Europe, and Asia. Now count the available caves in those regions that are actually habitable. Deep enough for shelter, but not so deep you can't see. Dry enough to keep you warm, but with enough ventilation that you don't suffocate from your own cooking fires. You run out of caves pretty quickly. So where did they live? Most prehistoric humans were building shelters, temporary structures made from branches, animal skins, maybe some strategic use of large bones from megafauna. They were setting up camps near water sources, moving seasonally to follow game herds and plant harvests. They used caves when they found good ones, sure. Caves make excellent temporary shelters, especially during harsh weather. But they were opportunistic about it, not obligate cave dwellers. The reason we call them cavemen at all is because caves preserve evidence better than open-air sites. A campsite on an ancient riverbank gets washed away, covered by sediment, destroyed by erosion. But a cave is basically a time capsule. Artifacts accumulate, bones pile up, layer after layer of occupation gets sealed by mineral deposits and preserved for hundreds of thousands of years. So when archaeologists go looking for prehistoric humans, they find them in caves, not because that's where ancient people exclusively lived, but because that's where the evidence survived. It's a sampling bias that shaped our entire understanding of prehistory. But let's put aside the naming problem and talk about who these people actually were. Because caveman doesn't just misrepresent where they lived. It flattens millions of years and multiple species into one cartoon stereotype. The timeline we're discussing spans roughly 2 million years. From the emergence of Homo erectus around 2 million years ago, through the evolution of archaic human species, up to the appearance of modern Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago, and continuing right up until the end of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago. That's not one story. That's dozens of stories, hundreds of distinct populations, multiple human species living, adapting, and sometimes going extinct across a world that looked radically different from ours. Start with Homo erectus. These weren't your ancestors in the direct sense, but they were probably your great-great-great-grandmother's cousins, many thousands of times removed. Homo erectus was the first human species to really master fire, the first to spread out of Africa into Asia and Europe. They had smaller brains than you do, maybe 900 cubic centimeters compared to your 1,400. But they weren't stupid. They made sophisticated stone tools. They hunted cooperatively. They probably had some form of language, though nothing like the complexity we use today. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus was the dominant human species on the planet. Think about that time span. Modern Homo sapiens has only been around for 300,000 years. Homo erectus lasted 3 times that long. They were successful, adaptable, capable of surviving in environments ranging from tropical Africa to temperate China. Then, around 800,000 years ago, something happened. We covered this earlier, the genetic bottleneck that nearly wiped out our lineage. When the survivors emerged from that crisis, they weren't Homo erectus anymore. They had been transformed by natural selection into something new. These post-bottleneck populations split into 3 distinct evolutionary paths. In Africa, one group continued evolving toward modern Homo sapiens. In Europe and Western Asia, another group adapted to Ice Age conditions and became Neanderthals. In Eastern Asia, a third group spread across the continent and became the Denisovans. For hundreds of thousands of years, these 3 human species existed simultaneously. They weren't competing for the same territories initially. Africa is huge, Europe is massive, Asia is incomprehensibly vast. There was room for everyone, at least for a while, but they weren't isolated from each other either. Trade goods moved between groups, ideas spread across vast distances, and when populations did encounter each other, they sometimes interbred. We know this because modern humans who aren't of pure African ancestry carry Neanderthal DNA. People across Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. These weren't completely separate species that couldn't interbreed. They were more like subspecies, different enough to have distinct characteristics, but similar enough to produce fertile offspring. Now let's talk about the world they inhabited. The Pleistocene epoch, roughly 2.6 million to 12,000 years ago, was the age of ice. Not continuously, not everywhere, but in cycles. Massive glacial periods when ice sheets covered huge portions of the northern continents, alternating with warmer interglacial periods when the ice retreated and sea levels rose. During glacial maximums, which lasted tens of thousands of years at a stretch, the world looked alien. Ice sheets, kilometers thick, covered Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. So much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped by 120 meters. Land bridges appeared, connecting Britain to France, Alaska to Siberia, Southeast Asian islands into continuous land masses. The climate was colder everywhere, not just near the ice. Tropical rainforests shrank, grasslands and steppes expanded. But it wasn't just cold and static. The climate fluctuated wildly on timescales of centuries or even decades. A group that had successfully adapted to particular conditions might find those conditions completely transformed within a few generations. This is the environment that shaped human evolution. Constant change, perpetual adaptation, populations that couldn't innovate, couldn't adjust their strategies when conditions shifted, they went extinct. The ones that survived were the flexible ones, the creative ones, the groups that could develop new tools and techniques fast enough to keep pace with environmental change. This is why human brains got so large. Not because bigger is automatically better. Big brains are expensive. They consume about 20% of your calories despite being only 2% of your body weight. Evolution doesn't maintain expensive organs unless they provide serious advantages. But in a world of constant environmental change, a big brain was worth the cost. The ability to learn quickly, to remember complex information, to plan ahead, to communicate detailed instructions to other group members, these cognitive abilities were the difference between survival and extinction. Neanderthals actually had slightly larger brains than modern humans, averaging about 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. But brain size isn't everything. Modern humans seem to have developed more efficient neural architecture, particularly in regions associated with abstract reasoning and symbolic thinking. We were better at innovation, better at adapting our behavior to new challenges without waiting for genetic evolution to catch up. This gave us an edge, but it wasn't an overwhelming advantage. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted in the Middle East and Europe. Neanderthals were physically stronger, better adapted to cold climates, incredibly skilled hunters. Modern humans were more innovative, more socially connected, better at sharing information across large groups. It was a close contest. If things had gone slightly differently, we might be talking about Neanderthal civilization today, trying to reconstruct what their extinct cousins, the Homo sapiens, were like. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. How do we actually know any of this? How can archaeologists and anthropologists reconstruct the lives of people who died hundreds of thousands of years ago without leaving any written records? The answer is forensic work on a massive scale. Every scrap of evidence gets analysed, compared, interpreted. Stone tools reveal manufacturing techniques and cognitive capabilities, where patterns on the cutting edges tell us what materials they were working with. Animal bones at archaeological sites show what they hunted and how they butchered their prey. Chemical analysis of ancient teeth reveals what they ate, even distinguishing between meat, plants, and fish in their diets. Microscopic examination of tool edges can identify what materials they were used on. Cut marks on bones reveal butchery patterns. Burn patterns show how they used fire. The placement of hearths in ancient campsites tells us about social organization and activity areas. And then, there are the bones themselves, the actual human remains. Skeleton analysis reveals stresses and injuries, showing us what kinds of physical challenges they faced. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA tells us about population movements, interbreeding events, and evolutionary relationships between groups. But here's what makes this really challenging. The evidence is scattered and fragmentary. We have thousands of stone tools for every human skeleton. We have more information about some time periods and regions than others. Africa is underrepresented in the archaeological record compared to Europe, not because there were fewer people there, but because preservation conditions are worse and there's been less excavation. This means our picture of prehistoric life is always incomplete, always being revised as new evidence emerges. 20 years ago, we didn't know Denisovans existed. They were discovered entirely through genetic analysis of a single finger bone from a Siberian cave. Now we know they were a major human species that spread across half of Asia. What else don't we know? What other human species existed that we haven't discovered yet? The fossil record is sparse enough that entirely new species could be waiting for discovery. But despite the gaps, a coherent picture has emerged. Prehistoric humans were regionally diverse but fundamentally similar. African populations tended toward lighter builds and greater height, adaptations to hot climates. European Neanderthals were stockier and more muscular, built for cold weather survival. Asian groups showed incredible adaptability, with some populations developing high-altitude adaptations and others becoming skilled seafarers. Yet they all shared the same basic survival strategies. All of them made tools, used fire, hunted in groups and built shelters. All of them formed complex social bonds and maintained trade networks with neighbouring groups. All of them possessed language and symbolic thinking, though the sophistication varied between species and over time. They weren't primitive versions of us, stuck in an earlier stage of development, waiting to evolve into something better. They were fully adapted to their environments, as intelligent and capable as necessary to survive in some of the harshest conditions humans have ever faced. In fact, In some ways, they might have been more capable than we are. Modern humans have outsourced so much of our survival to technology and social systems that most of us would die within days if dropped into the Ice Age environment our ancestors navigated successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. So when we use the term caveman, remember what we're really talking about. Not brutish primitives, but diverse populations of intelligent, adaptable, innovative people who survived a world we can barely imagine. They were our ancestors, and their story is just beginning. Let's clear something up right now. The term caveman is one of the most misleading pieces of vocabulary in all of human prehistory. It conjures images of primitive families huddled permanently in dark caves, living their entire lives underground like some kind of human mole people. But that's not what happened. Not even close. The truth is far more interesting, far more sophisticated, and reveals something crucial about human adaptability. Your prehistoric ancestors weren't cave dwellers. They were strategic nomads, expert architects of temporary structures, and masters of reading landscapes to find the perfect campsite. They used caves, sure, but they also built elaborate shelters, followed complex migration patterns, and created living spaces that would have taken considerable planning and skill. So where did they actually live? The answer depends entirely on when, where, and what the climate was doing at the time, because prehistoric humans weren't living in one way. They were adapting constantly, building different types of shelters for different seasons, different environments, different needs. Let's start with the caves, since that's where the misconception begins. Caves were seasonal shelters. Think of them like rest stops on a highway, places you'd use when conditions demanded it, but not where you'd want to spend your entire life. And for good reason. Most caves are cold, damp, dark, and frankly pretty miserable places to live full time. They lack proper ventilation. Smoke from fires gets trapped. They're often home to dangerous animals like cave bears, cave lions, or hyenas, who had the same idea about using caves for shelter. But during certain times of year, especially harsh winters or dangerous seasons, caves became invaluable. The archaeological evidence from famous cave sites like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain shows something fascinating. These weren't permanent residences. They were seasonal camps used repeatedly over thousands of years, but only during specific times. The layers of occupation are thin, interrupted, showing people coming and going with the seasons. When prehistoric groups did use caves, they transformed them. They didn't just huddle in the darkness. They built interior structures within the cave, creating rooms using animal hides stretched over wooden frames. They dug fire pits in strategic locations to maximize heat and minimize smoke. They created designated sleeping areas, cooking areas, tool-making areas. They were organizing space, creating the first interior architecture. The real revelation comes when you look at where most prehistoric people actually spent their time. Not in caves at all, but in constructed shelters out in the open. And some of these structures were absolutely remarkable. In Ukraine, archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings built entirely from mammoth bones. Not just a few bones arranged to support, but elaborate structures using hundreds of bones from dozens of mammoths, carefully selected and arranged. Picture this, your ancestors tracking a mammoth herd across the frozen steppes. They make a kill, one of the massive adults. First priority is the meat, tons of it, which they'll preserve by freezing or drying. But they're also looking at something else, the skeleton. Those massive curved ribs, those enormous leg bones, that skull weighing hundreds of pounds. They're seeing building materials. Over the next weeks they construct a dwelling, long mammoth leg bones driven into the ground as foundation posts, massive skulls arranged in a circular pattern to form walls, ribs and smaller bones woven together to create a dome-shaped framework. The whole structure is then covered with animal hides, probably mammoth or bison, stitched together and weighted down with more bones to prevent the brutal step winds from tearing everything apart. Inside, they dig the floor down slightly, creating better insulation. They build a central fire pit with a carefully designed smoke hole in the roof. Around the edges, they create sleeping platforms using smaller bones covered with furs and dried grass. The result is a structure that could house 15 or 20 people comfortably, providing protection from temperatures that could drop to minus 30 or 40 degrees. These weren't crude emergency shelters. Some mammoth bone dwellings show evidence of years of occupation, with repairs, modifications and improvements made over multiple generations. They represent serious engineering, careful planning, and considerable communal effort. Building one would have taken weeks and required the cooperation of the entire group. In warmer climates, the shelters looked completely different. Along rivers and coastlines, prehistoric people built simple but effective structures using wooden poles covered with animal hides, bark, or woven plant materials. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean shows post holes arranged in circular or oval patterns, indicating structures that looked remarkably similar to the teepees and yurts still used by nomadic peoples today. The design principles were surprisingly sophisticated. Conical or dome-shaped structures are incredibly wind-resistant and shed rain effectively. Circular floor plans maximize interior space while minimizing the amount of building materials needed. Entranceways typically faced away from prevailing winds. Smoke holes could be opened or closed depending on weather conditions. But the real genius was in their temporary nature. These structures could be built in a day or two, used for weeks or months, then abandoned when it was time to move. The poles might be carried to the next campsite or left behind if wood was plentiful in the next location. The hides and other coverings were definitely carried, since they represented valuable processed materials that took considerable effort to create. Which brings us to something crucial. Fire. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was the center of prehistoric home life. Every camp, whether cave or constructed shelter, organized itself around fire. The hearth was where food was cooked, tools were made, stories were told, and social bonds were maintained. Archaeological evidence shows that prehistoric people managed fire with remarkable sophistication. They didn't just light a fire and let it burn. They maintained specific types of fires for specific purposes: hot, fast-burning fires for cooking meat, slower, smoky fires for preserving food or keeping insects away, carefully banked fires that could be kept smouldering overnight with minimal fuel, ready to be revived in the morning. They understood different woods and their properties, which burned hot, which created good coals, which produced minimal smoke. Fire provided warmth, obviously crucial in Ice Age climates, but it also extended the day, allowing activities to continue after dark. It provided protection, since most predators are instinctively afraid of fire. Perhaps most importantly, it created a social center. Around the fire, the group came together, shared food, made tools, taught children, planned hunts, resolved disputes, and maintained the social cohesion that was essential for survival. The evidence for their attention to comfort is actually quite touching. Archaeological sites show they created bedding using dried grass, leaves, and ferns, layered to provide insulation from the cold ground. They covered these plant materials with animal furs, creating sleeping surfaces that were probably warmer and more comfortable than many modern camping setups. Some sites show small depressions worn into rock surfaces where people slept in the same spots repeatedly over years, creating natural body-shaped sleeping areas. They even show evidence of pest management. Some sites contain remains of aromatic plants like artemisia or juniper that would have been used to repel insects and create pleasant smells. They were making their living spaces more comfortable, more livable. They weren't just surviving, they were trying to make home feel like home. But home wasn't a fixed location. For most prehistoric people, home was wherever the group happened to be at that moment. They followed seasonal migration patterns that could span hundreds of miles annually. In spring, they might follow herds of reindeer or caribou north as the animals moved to calving grounds. Summer might find them at coastal locations taking advantage of fish runs and shellfish. Autumn was for following herds south and gathering nuts, berries, and seeds. Winter meant retreating to sheltered locations with stored food supplies. These migration patterns weren't random wandering. They were carefully planned routes following the availability of resources. The same campsites were used year after year, generation after generation. Prehistoric people developed intimate knowledge of vast territories, knowing where water sources could be found, where certain plants grew, where animals were likely to be during different seasons, which locations offered the best shelter. The criteria for choosing a campsite were remarkably consistent across different cultures and time periods. Water was the first priority. You need to be near a reliable source, but not too near, since river valleys could flood and lake shores attracted predators. Slightly elevated locations were preferred, offering better views of approaching dangers and better drainage. South-facing locations in northern latitudes provided more sunlight and warmth. They also looked for what archaeologists call prospect and refuge, locations that offered both good visibility of the surrounding landscape and nearby places to hide or defend if necessary. A campsite near a cliff face or dense forest provided an escape route if predators or hostile groups approached. Proximity to good hunting grounds was crucial, but so was access to stone for tool-making and wood for fires and construction. The sophistication of their site selection becomes obvious when you look at famous prehistoric dwelling locations. Lascaux Cave in France wasn't chosen randomly. It's located in a valley rich with game animals, near a river, with good visibility of the surrounding landscape. The cave itself is complex, with multiple chambers that could be used for different purposes: storage, sleeping, ceremonies, tool-making. Altamira in Spain shows similar strategic selection. The cave entrance faces south, maximizing sunlight and warmth. It's located on a hillside with excellent drainage and views of a fertile valley below. The interior stays relatively dry compared to many caves, and natural features in the rock provided ready-made storage areas and living spaces. The mammoth bone huts of Ukraine were built on the open steppes, specifically because that's where the mammoths were. These groups were following herds year-round, and they needed permanent or semi-permanent bases in mammoth territory. They chose locations with slight elevations to avoid the worst of the wind, near small rivers or streams for water, in areas where the mammoths congregated regularly. What's remarkable is how climate changes forced constant adaptation. During warm periods, lighter structures and more frequent moves were possible. People could follow resources more flexibly, building simple shelters and moving every few weeks. During cold periods, especially during glacial maximums, they had to become more sedentary, building more substantial shelters and relying more on stored food. The archaeological record shows this flexibility clearly. Toolkits change, dwelling structures evolve, and site selection criteria shift in response to environmental pressures. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets covered much of Europe and North America, prehistoric people in some regions developed what archaeologists call collector strategies. Instead of moving constantly, they built more permanent base camps and sent out specialized hunting parties to bring resources back. This required more substantial shelters, better storage facilities, and more complex social organization. The mammoth bone huts represent this strategy taken to its logical conclusion. semi-permanent villages in resource-rich areas. The evidence suggests they were good at what they did. Most prehistoric campsites show signs of extended occupation without disaster. They managed to keep fires controlled, avoid structural collapses, and maintain sanitary conditions well enough to prevent disease outbreaks. They created living spaces that protected them from the elements, provided security from predators, and met their social and psychological needs for comfort and community. So, no, they weren't cavemen in the cartoon sense. They were adaptive architects who understood their environments intimately and created appropriate shelters for every season and situation. They were builders, planners, and engineers working with Stone Age materials, but applying sophisticated principles that wouldn't be out of place in modern survival manuals. They made homes in a world that was trying very hard to kill them, and those homes were good enough to keep humanity alive through the worst the planet could throw at them. That's worth remembering next time someone calls them primitive. Let's talk about what your ancestor actually ate, and I mean really ate, not the romanticized version you see in museum dioramas, where heroic hunters are always bringing down mammoths while everyone cheers. The truth is more interesting, more complex, and honestly, more impressive. Your prehistoric ancestor had one of the most diverse diets in human history, not because they had grocery stores or global supply chains, but because they had to. Survival meant eating whatever was available, and that changed constantly with the seasons, the weather, the migrations of animals, and sheer luck. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living analogues to prehistoric life, have discovered something surprising. These people typically eat between 50 and 150 different plant and animal species over the course of a year. Compare that to the average modern Western diet, which relies on maybe 15 to 20 staple foods. We think we have variety because we have 50 brands of breakfast cereal, but our ancestors had actual nutritional diversity. Their diet was a constantly shifting mosaic of whatever the landscape offered. Spring meant bird eggs, new plant shoots, fish running up rivers to spawn. Summer brought berries, fruits, honey from wild beehives, and fat game animals. Fall was nut season, acorns, hazelnuts, walnuts, each providing concentrated calories that could be stored for leaner times. Winter meant relying on preserved foods, hunting animals desperate enough to be catchable, and hoping the stores would last until spring returned. But here's what most people get wrong about prehistoric diet. The hunting part, the dramatic part where humans chased down large animals with spears that probably provided only 30 to 40% of the calories most groups consumed. The rest, the majority of what kept people alive, came from gathering. And gathering was anything but simple. Think about this. Your ancestor needed to know hundreds of plant species by sight, smell, and touch. They needed to know which parts were edible and when. The same plant might have nutritious roots in spring, poisonous leaves in summer, and edible seeds in fall. Eat the wrong part at the wrong time, and you die. Feed it to your children, and they die. There was no guidebook, no poison control center, just knowledge passed down generation by generation, refined through countless bitter experiences. Women typically did most of the gathering, but calling it a simple task misses the point entirely. These were expert botanists, skilled ecologists who could read the landscape like we read street signs. They knew which trees hosted edible mushrooms, which rocks sheltered the best shellfish, which meadows would produce edible bulbs after rain. They understood seasonal patterns, plant life cycles, and the subtle indicators that told them when and where to look for specific resources. And they were incredibly efficient. Studies of modern Hadza people in Tanzania, who still practice traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyles, show that women can gather enough calories to feed themselves and their children in about 4 to 6 hours of work per day. That's right. They spend less time obtaining food than most modern people spend at their jobs. But those 6 hours required encyclopedic knowledge and constant attention. A Hadza woman gathering baobab fruit knows not just where the trees are, but which trees produce the best fruit in which years, how to process the fruit efficiently, what tools to bring, and which family members need the nutrients that particular food provides. She's simultaneously gathering food, teaching her daughters, maintaining social relationships with other women in the gathering party, and keeping track of potential dangers. It's complex work requiring intelligence, memory, and social skills. Meanwhile, the hunting was its own form of genius. Forget the image of the lone caveman tracking a mammoth across the tundra. Successful hunting was almost always a group activity, carefully coordinated, requiring communication, planning, and deep understanding of animal behavior. Your ancestors hunted in ways that would impress modern wildlife biologists. They understood migration patterns, seasonal movements, feeding behaviors. They knew that certain animals could be found in specific locations at specific times because of factors we'd call ecology, hydrology, and behavioral biology. They might not have had the scientific vocabulary, but they had the knowledge. Ambush hunting was probably the most common technique. Find a game trail, a water source, a narrow passage between cliffs, someplace animals had to pass through regularly. Then wait. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until the opportunity presented itself. This required patience, silence, the ability to remain motionless despite cold, hunger, and discomfort. It required understanding wind direction so animals couldn't smell human scent. It required knowing exactly when to strike and when to let a target pass because the shot wasn't good enough. The weapons themselves were marvels of prehistoric engineering. Spears with carefully shaped stone points, balanced for throwing, weighted properly for the hunter's arm strength and the intended prey. Later, the atlatl, a spear thrower that used leverage to multiply throwing force, allowing hunters to kill large animals from safer distances. Some groups developed specialized weapons for different prey, light throwing spears for fast animals like deer, heavy thrusting spears for dangerous game like boar or bear. But individual skill meant nothing without coordination. Driving hunts required multiple hunters working together, some to flush animals from cover, others to block escape routes, still others positioned at the kill zone. This required planning, communication, often elaborate preparation. Some groups dug pits and covered them with branches. Others built funneling structures from rocks and brush, creating channels that guided panicked animals toward waiting hunters. And then there was megafauna hunting. The big game. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet. These weren't regular prey. They were occasional opportunities, high-risk, high-reward events that could feed a community for weeks, but could also kill hunters in seconds. Mammoth hunting sites across Europe and Asia show evidence of sophisticated strategies. Groups would target young, old, or injured animals, individuals separated from the protective herd. They'd use fire to stampede animals toward cliffs or bogs where the massive creatures would become trapped. Some sites show evidence of hunters working in teams of 20 or 30, coordinating attacks with multiple spears, targeting vulnerable areas, legs to immobilize, torso to cause bleeding. A slow, dangerous process of wearing down an animal that weighed 6 tons and could crush a human without noticing. When a mammoth hunt succeeded, the entire community mobilized. Butchering a mammoth required specialized knowledge, which cuts to take first before the meat spoiled, how to render fat for cooking and light, how to separate sinews for cordage, bones for tools, hide for clothing. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death when the next hunt might fail. But most days weren't about mammoths. Most days were about rabbits, fish, birds, turtles, insects even, protein wherever it could be found. Coastal communities living near oceans or large rivers developed their own expertise. They learned tidal patterns, understanding when shellfish beds would be exposed. They developed traps for fish, woven structures placed in streams to catch migrating salmon or trout. Some groups ventured onto the water in primitive boats, pursuing seals or diving for shellfish in deeper waters. The archaeological evidence from coastal sites is remarkable. Shell middens, massive mounds of discarded shells, sometimes dozens of feet deep, representing thousands of years of continuous shellfish harvesting. These weren't just garbage dumps. They were evidence of sustainable resource management. Communities that returned to the same location season after season, generation after generation, carefully managing their harvest to ensure the population remained viable. And they developed preservation techniques that would seem sophisticated even today. Smoking meat over fires to prevent spoilage, drying fish and meat in the sun and wind, using natural refrigeration, storing food in caves where temperatures remained cold year-round, or during winter burying meat in snowbanks and permafrost. Some groups learned to ferment foods, allowing them to preserve fish and meat through bacterial processes we now understand but they mastered through trial and error. The division of labour wasn't absolute, though. Women occasionally hunted, especially for smaller game. Men gathered when opportunity presented. The old notion of rigid sex roles doesn't match the archaeological or ethnographic evidence. Survival required flexibility. If the hunters came back empty-handed, which happened regularly, the gathered foods kept everyone alive. If gathering was poor due to drought or unseasonable cold, successful hunting became critical. And here's something that surprises people. Your prehistoric ancestors probably worked less than you do. Those modern hunter-gatherers we can study directly typically spend 20 to 30 hours per week on food acquisition. Add in food processing, tool maintenance, shelter upkeep, and you're still looking at maybe 40 hours of necessary work per week, with significant variation based on season and location. The rest of their time, social activities, storytelling, teaching children, creating art, playing, resting. Contrary to the popular image of prehistoric life as constant, desperate struggle, most groups in decent territories had substantial leisure time. The struggle came during bad years, droughts, unusually harsh winters, periods when game animals disappeared or plant crops failed. Then survival became desperate, consuming every waking hour. But those were the exceptions, not the rule. The caloric needs were substantial, though. An active adult human needs roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day just to maintain body weight. In cold climates, or during periods of heavy physical activity, that number could climb to 3,000 or even 4,000. Your ancestors burned calories like we burn gasoline, constantly, necessarily, urgently. Meeting those needs required constant attention to the landscape, knowing where the food was, understanding seasonal patterns, predicting where resources would appear based on weather and other environmental factors. This knowledge was the most valuable possession any group had. More important than tools, more critical than fire, more precious than the best shelter. Knowledge kept you alive when everything else failed, and they passed it on with incredible fidelity. Children learned by observation and practice. A child watching her mother process plant foods learned not just the technique, but the reasoning, the decision-making process. A boy following his father on hunts learned animal behavior, tracking skills, weapon use, the patience and courage required to face dangerous prey. This was education without schools, knowledge transmission without writing, cultural continuity without institutions. And it worked for hundreds of thousands of years, sustaining human populations through climate changes, environmental disasters, and the everyday challenges of survival. In a world that offered no guarantees except that tomorrow would require the same skills, the same knowledge, the same hard-won wisdom that kept your ancestors alive today. Every meal was a victory. Every successful hunt, every productive gathering session, every fish caught or bird snared represented the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. Your ancestor eating dinner by the fire wasn't just consuming calories. They were benefiting from an unbroken chain of survival expertise stretching back to the bottleneck and beyond, refined through experience, tested by necessity, passed forward to ensure that tomorrow's children would also know how to find food in a world that gave up its bounty only to those who understood its patterns, and somehow, impossibly, beautifully, it worked. Picture yourself holding a rock, just an ordinary rock, the kind you might find in any riverbed. Now imagine looking at that rock and seeing something nobody else can see. A knife hidden inside the stone waiting to be released, a spear point, a scraper, a tool that could mean the difference between your family eating tonight or going hungry. This wasn't magic. This was the beginning of technology. And your prehistoric ancestors were masters at it. For millions of years, human ancestors had been making tools, simple ones at first. Pick up a rock, smash it against another rock, use the sharp edge to cut meat or scrape hides. These Oldowan choppers, named after the gorge in Tanzania where archaeologists first found them, were humanity's first manufactured objects. They don't look like much. Irregular chunks of stone with one crudely sharpened edge. A modern person might walk right past one without recognizing it as a tool at all. But for early humans, these simple implements were revolutionary. They could process food that would otherwise be inedible, cut through tough animal hides, sharpen wooden digging sticks. A single stone chopper could provide advantages that rippled through every aspect of survival. But then something changed. Around 1.8 million years ago, someone figured out something new. Instead of just making one sharp edge, they created symmetrical tools with carefully shaped sides, hand axes. These weren't random chunks of rock anymore. They were designed objects crafted with intention and skill. Making a proper hand axe required planning. You had to select the right kind of stone, usually flint or obsidian, rocks that fracture in predictable ways. You had to understand how force applied at one angle would create flakes at another. You had to be able to picture the finished tool hidden inside the raw material and work systematically to reveal it. This is called prepared core technique, and it represents a massive cognitive leap. You're not just reacting to immediate needs anymore. You're thinking ahead, planning, envisioning outcomes that don't exist yet. For over 1 million years, hand axes remain the dominant tool technology. Archaeologists find them across Africa, Europe, and Asia, remarkably similar in design despite being separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. This suggests something profound. These weren't random inventions being discovered over and over. This was cultural knowledge being passed down, generation to generation, across vast distances and enormous spans of time. Your ancestors were teaching their children, not just showing them, but verbally instructing them in the complex skills required to turn stone into tools. But the real explosion of innovation came after the bottleneck. Those survivors we talked about earlier, the ones who made it through 117,000 years of near extinction, they emerged with something their ancestors hadn't possessed: enhanced cognitive abilities, better problem-solving skills, and most importantly, the capacity for rapid cultural evolution. Within a few 100,000 years, stone tool technology transformed from simple hand axes into an arsenal of specialized implements, each designed for specific tasks. The Levallois technique emerged around 300,000 years ago, and it was like going from a bicycle to a sports car. Instead of shaping the tool directly, toolmakers learned to prepare stone cores so carefully that they could strike off ready-made tools with a single blow. Imagine this. You spend hours carefully shaping a stone core, removing flakes in a precise sequence, creating a raised platform in exactly the right place. Then, with one perfectly aimed strike, a finished spear point or cutting blade pops off the core, already shaped, already sharp, ready to use, and you can do it again and again. A single prepared core could produce dozens of identical tools. This is manufacturing, mass production. It requires understanding geometry, force distribution, material properties. It requires the ability to delay gratification, spending hours preparing a core before getting any useful tools from it. Your prehistoric ancestors weren't primitive, they were engineers. But stone tools were just the beginning. Sometime around 90,000 years ago, your ancestors started working with other materials: bone, antler, ivory. These organic materials could be shaped into tools that stone couldn't replicate: awls for punching holes in hides, needles for sewing, harpoons for fishing. And here's where things get really interesting. Creating bone tools required different techniques entirely. You couldn't just chip away at bone like you could with stone. You had to abrade it, grinding it against sandstone for hours to create the right shape. You had to heat treat it carefully to make it harder without making it brittle. Some bone tools show evidence of being soaked in water or plant resins to make them more flexible during shaping, then dried to lock in the new form. This suggests knowledge of material science that would have taken generations of experimentation to develop. The invention of the needle might not sound impressive, but it changed everything. Before needles, humans could drape hides over their bodies for warmth, maybe tie them on with strips of leather, but with needles they could create fitted clothing, garments with sleeves, pants, boots. This meant they could survive in environments that would have killed them otherwise. The expansion into Ice Age Europe, into the frozen steppes of Asia, into the Arctic, none of that would have been possible without the humble needle, and making needles was incredibly difficult. You had to create a tool small enough and fine enough to thread sinew through tiny holes, strong enough not to break under tension, sharp enough to pierce tough leather. Some prehistoric needles found by archaeologists are so fine and perfectly formed that modern craftspeople struggle to replicate them using ancient techniques. Then there's hafting, the practice of attaching stone tools to wooden handles. This might sound simple, but think about what it requires. You need to select the right wood, shape it properly, create a secure socket for the stone point, then you need adhesive. Archaeological evidence shows prehistoric people using plant resins heated and mixed with ochre and beeswax to create glues that could withstand tremendous force. They were creating composite materials, combining different substances to achieve properties that none of them possessed individually. Some hafted spears from 300,000 years ago show such sophisticated construction that researchers spent years figuring out how they were made. Multiple materials, each requiring different processing techniques, combined in precise ways to create tools that were greater than the sum of their parts. And then came the atlatl, the spear thrower. This might be the most underappreciated invention in human history. It's basically a stick with a hook on the end that extends your arm length when throwing a spear. Doesn't sound like much, right? But it effectively doubled the power and range of spear throwing. Physics. That's what the atlatl represents. Someone, somewhere, figured out the principle of leverage. They understood that extending the length of the throwing arm would increase the velocity of the projectile. They couldn't write equations or draw diagrams, but they grasped the fundamental physics, and they spread this knowledge. Atlatls show up in archaeological sites across multiple continents, from Europe to Australia, from Africa to the Americas. Different designs, adapted to local materials and prey animals, but all based on the same principle. This is technology transfer on a global scale. What's remarkable is that different human populations were developing different tool traditions, regional styles that reflect local needs and cultural preferences. In Africa, you find microlithic technology, tiny stone blades that could be mounted in wooden handles to create composite tools. Dozens of small blades arranged along the edge of a wooden club, creating a saw-like weapon far more effective than any single large blade. In Europe, Neanderthals were perfecting their spear technology, creating points so perfectly balanced and aerodynamic that modern replicas can be thrown with deadly accuracy at 20 yards. In Asia, there's evidence of bamboo technology. Bamboo doesn't preserve well archaeologically, but where patterns on stone tools suggest they were being used to work bamboo into everything from containers to construction materials. These regional variations tell us something important. Tool-making wasn't just about survival, it was about culture, identity. When you learned to make tools, you weren't just learning techniques. You were learning your people's way of doing things, the specific hand positions your group used, the particular types of stone they preferred, the exact angle at which they struck the core. These details varied from region to region, from group to group, creating what archaeologists call techno-complexes, shared technological traditions that mark cultural boundaries. When archaeologists find a particular style of tool in a new location, they can trace migration patterns, track the movement of ideas and people across the prehistoric world. But perhaps the most cognitively demanding innovation was the creation of compound tools. Tools made from multiple parts, each requiring different materials and different manufacturing techniques, all designed to work together. A hafted spear with a stone point, wooden shaft and sinew binding sealed with resin adhesive. This isn't just tool making, this is systems thinking. You have to understand how each component contributes to the whole. You have to be able to plan a manufacturing sequence that might take days or weeks. First, find and process the stone, then locate and harvest the right wood, season it properly, shape it. Prepare the adhesive, which means finding resin-producing trees, heating the resin to the right temperature, adding the correct proportions of additives. Then assemble everything in the right sequence, allowing proper curing time between steps. Some compound tools show evidence of repair and modification, suggesting people maintained and improved their implements over years of use. They weren't disposable, they were valuable, probably passed down through families, accumulating histories. That spear your father used to bring down the mammoth that fed your band through a brutal winter. The knife your grandmother used for 40 years, resharpened so many times that the blade was half its original size, but still perfectly functional. These tools carried stories, memories, knowledge accumulated across generations. And here's what really separates human technology from anything else in nature. Other animals use tools. Chimps use sticks to fish for termites. Otters use rocks to crack open shells. But only humans teach tool-making as culture. A chimp that discovers a particularly effective termite fishing technique might pass it to offspring through observation. But humans verbally instruct. They explain not just what to do, but why. They correct mistakes. They share innovations. They build on knowledge accumulated over generations. This is cumulative cultural evolution. And it's what allowed human technology to advance far beyond anything possible through individual learning. By 40,000 years ago, human toolkits had become sophisticated enough to support life in virtually any environment on Earth. Specialized hunting tools for different prey animals, processing tools for different plant foods, construction tools for building shelters, clothing manufacturing tools for surviving extreme cold, fire-making technology that allowed reliable ignition even in wet conditions. food storage techniques that could preserve meat for months. Your prehistoric ancestors weren't primitive survivors scraping by with crude implements. They were skilled craftspeople with specialized knowledge, capable of manufacturing complex tools that required years of training to master. And they were innovating constantly, every generation adding refinements, discovering new techniques, adapting tools to new challenges. The archaeological record shows a steady acceleration of technological change, especially after 50,000 years ago. New tool types appearing more frequently, regional variations becoming more pronounced, specialized implements designed for specific tasks proliferating. This is the signature of cultural evolution in high gear, ideas competing, successful innovations spreading rapidly, unsuccessful ones disappearing. These tools were doing more than just helping people survive. They were changing the human brain, shaping our cognitive evolution. The demands of tool-making selected for enhanced manual dexterity, spatial reasoning, planning ability, abstract thinking. Every generation, individuals who were slightly better at these skills had advantages. They made better tools, hunted more successfully, attracted better mates, passed on their genes. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this feedback loop between tools and brains drove the evolution of human intelligence. So when you think about prehistoric technology, don't picture crude cavemen banging rocks together. Picture skilled artisans who understood materials, science, physics, engineering. Picture teachers passing knowledge to students across generations. Picture innovators experimenting with new techniques, spreading successful ideas across continents. Your ancestors weren't waiting for the modern world to arrive. They were building it, one stone blade at a time, one hafted spear, one perfectly crafted needle. They were the engineers of the human revolution, and everything that came after began with their innovations, their creativity, their refusal to accept that the tools they inherited were good enough. They kept improving, kept inventing, kept pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And that drive, that endless human compulsion to make things better, that's their legacy. That's still driving us forward today. Here's something that would probably surprise you about prehistoric humans. They weren't loners. They weren't fierce individualists battling nature alone. In fact, they were probably more socially interconnected than most people living today. Your prehistoric ancestors survived because they were fundamentally, deeply, uncompromisingly social, and the archaeological evidence for this is everywhere once you know where to look. Let's start with the basics. Band size. For most of human prehistory, people lived in groups of roughly 25 to 50 individuals. Not 5, not 500, but somewhere right in that middle range. And that number isn't random. It's actually the optimal size for mobile hunter-gatherer communities. Too few people, and you don't have enough hands to handle all the tasks necessary for survival. Can't hunt large game effectively, can't defend territory, can't care for the sick and elderly while others are out gathering resources. But too many people, and you run into different problems. Resources get depleted too quickly. Conflicts become harder to resolve, and the group becomes too unwieldy to move efficiently when conditions change. 25 to 50 people hits the sweet spot. It's small enough that everyone knows everyone else personally, intimately. You're not just living with strangers, you're living with people whose quirks, strengths, and weaknesses you know as well as your own. You know which uncle tells the best stories, which aunt has the surest hand with a scraper, which cousin can track a wounded animal across bare rock. This deep personal knowledge creates what anthropologists call high social cohesion. Everyone understands their role, everyone knows they're needed, and everyone has a stake in the group's survival. But here's where it gets really interesting. These bands weren't isolated units. They were connected to other bands through elaborate kinship networks that stretched across hundreds of miles. Your band of 40 people might maintain regular contact with a dozen other bands, creating a meta-community of several hundred individuals. This larger network served as insurance against disaster. If your band's territory got hit by drought or disease, you could seek refuge with your relatives 3 valleys over. If hunting was poor in your area, you could trade with bands that had better luck. This distributed risk model is actually incredibly sophisticated. Modern financial planners use the same basic principle. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. The evidence for these networks shows up in the archaeological record in fascinating ways. Stone tools found hundreds of miles from their source materials, shell beads in landlocked caves, obsidian from volcanic regions appearing in coastal settlements. Someone was moving these materials across vast distances, and it wasn't random trade. It was systematic exchange between groups who knew each other, trusted each other, and had ongoing relationships that spanned generations. Now let's talk about something that really demonstrates the humanity of our prehistoric ancestors. They took care of their vulnerable, not just sometimes, not just when it was convenient, but systematically as a core part of their social structure. We know this because of what paleoanthropologists find when they examine skeletal remains carefully. There's a Neanderthal skeleton from Shanidar Cave in Iraq. The individual had a withered arm, probably from birth, blind in one eye, significant injuries that would have left him partially disabled, and he lived to be somewhere around 40 years old, which was quite old for the period. Think about what that means. This person couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't contribute to defense, required extra food, extra care, extra attention, and his community kept him alive for decades. Someone had to feed him, protect him, help him move from camp to camp. That's not survival of the fittest in the brutal sense we often imagine. That's compassion. That's humanity. Similar examples appear across the prehistoric world. An elderly Homo erectus woman in Georgia with no teeth. She survived for years after losing them, which means someone was pre-chewing her food, or preparing it in ways she could manage. A child with severe developmental disabilities in a Paleolithic burial, carefully placed with grave goods, showing they were a valued member of the community despite never being able to contribute labour. These weren't exceptions. Archaeological evidence suggests caring for disabled and elderly members was standard practice across human populations. And there's a profound evolutionary logic to this that goes beyond simple compassion. Those elderly individuals were knowledge keepers, walking libraries of survival information. An elder who had lived through 40 or 50 years had experienced rare climate events, unusual animal behaviours, successful hunting techniques, edible plants in different seasons, medicinal remedies, dangerous territories. This knowledge was literally priceless. In a world without writing, without books, without Google, the memories of elders were the only way to preserve hard-won survival wisdom across generations. Keeping them alive meant keeping your community's accumulated knowledge alive, and they probably served another crucial function: storytelling. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies consistently find that elders are the primary storytellers. They pass down histories, myths, moral lessons and practical knowledge through narrative. Around the fire at night, while younger adults were preparing tools or tending to children, the elders would tell stories. Stories about the great hunt 3 winters ago. Stories about the time the river changed course. Stories about the ancestors and how they survived the lean years. This oral tradition created cultural continuity. It gave the community a shared identity, a sense of connection to past generations, and a framework for understanding their place in the world. The archaeological evidence suggests this tradition is ancient, possibly dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Cave paintings in France and Spain show what appear to be narrative sequences, stories told in images. These weren't created in isolation. They were probably accompanied by verbal narratives, stories that were told and retold, refined and passed down through countless generations. But let's talk about the most fundamental social unit, the family. Child-rearing in prehistoric communities was a communal effort in ways that would seem almost alien to modern nuclear families. When a woman gave birth, she wasn't expected to raise that child alone, or even primarily with just her partner. The entire band participated. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated adults all took active roles in childcare. This distributed parenting model had enormous advantages. First, it massively increased infant survival rates. If one caregiver was sick or injured, or needed to focus on other tasks, half a dozen other adults were ready to step in. Babies were rarely left unattended. They were constantly held, nursed, protected. This close contact not only kept them safer, but also accelerated their social development. They learned by observing multiple adults, picking up different skills, different ways of thinking, different knowledge sets. Second, it freed mothers to contribute to food gathering and other essential tasks much sooner than would be possible in isolated nuclear families. A mother could go foraging while her sister or mother watched the infant. This flexibility meant the community could deploy its labour more efficiently, adapting quickly to changing conditions. And third, it created deep social bonds between all community members. When everyone helps raise the children, everyone has investment in the next generation. The children, in turn, develop relationships with multiple adults, creating a dense network of connections that strengthens overall group cohesion. Modern anthropologists call this alloparenting, and it's actually quite common in highly social species. But humans took it further than almost any other mammal. Now, what about mating patterns? What do we know about prehistoric relationships? This is where the evidence gets complicated, but also fascinating. Skeletal analysis can tell us some things. By examining pelvic structures and cranial features across populations, researchers can track genetic exchange between groups, and what they find is interesting. Prehistoric populations show evidence of what geneticists call female exogamy. Women typically moved between bands more frequently than men. This makes evolutionary sense. If women stay in their birth bands, you risk inbreeding. But if women regularly move to neighbouring bands when they form partnerships, you maintain genetic diversity while strengthening inter-band connections. Think about what this means practically. When a young woman moved from her birth band to her partner's band, she brought with her all the knowledge and skills of her original community. New tool-making techniques, different foraging strategies, unique medicinal knowledge. She became a bridge between two communities, maintaining connections, facilitating trade and information exchange. This pattern of female exchange created the social networks that linked bands across vast territories. But were these relationships monogamous, polygamous, something else entirely? The honest answer is we don't know for certain, and it probably varied between different populations and time periods. What we do know is that prehistoric humans showed sophisticated understanding of kinship and relationship rules. The genetic evidence shows they consistently avoided close inbreeding, suggesting they had clear social rules about acceptable partnerships. They also show evidence of long-term pair bonding. Skeletons found in double burials, carefully placed together, sometimes with interlinked arms or facing each other. These weren't random. They suggest relationships that were recognized and honored even in death. Cooperation was the absolute foundation of survival, not just within bands, but between them. Archaeological sites show clear evidence of resource sharing. Large game kills with cut marks from multiple stone tool traditions, suggesting different bands came together for communal hunts. seasonal aggregation sites where hundreds of people gathered temporarily, probably to exploit seasonal resources like spawning fish or migrating herds. These gatherings served multiple purposes. Obviously, they allowed for more efficient resource exploitation. 100. People can harvest and process a migrating herd much more effectively than 30. But they also served crucial social functions. This was where young people found partners from other bands, where distant relatives reconnected, where traders exchanged exotic materials and finished goods, where knowledge was shared between communities, where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. And yes, there was conflict. The archaeological record isn't all peaceful cooperation. Some prehistoric skeletons show evidence of violent death, projectile points embedded in bone, defensive wounds on arms and hands, partially healed fractures consistent with interpersonal violence. Some sites show evidence of what might have been raids or territorial conflicts. But here's what's remarkable. These incidents of violence are relatively rare compared to the overwhelming evidence of cooperation. The vast majority of prehistoric sites show peaceful occupation, regular trade, resource sharing. For every skeleton showing violent trauma, there are dozens showing evidence of careful medical care, successful healing of serious injuries, long lives despite disabilities. This suggests that while conflict certainly occurred, it wasn't the dominant mode of existence. Most of the time, most communities were finding ways to coexist, cooperate, and maintain the social networks that made survival possible. They had probably developed sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms, ritual exchanges of gifts, formalized meeting protocols, perhaps early forms of diplomacy where respected elders from different bands would negotiate disputes. Some anthropologists think the elaborate cave paintings might have served partially as territorial markers, ways of establishing identity and boundaries without resorting to violence. The picture that emerges from all this evidence is of people who are fundamentally adapted for social living, not forced into it by necessity, but genuinely wired for connection, cooperation, and community. Their brains had evolved to track complex social relationships, to understand reciprocity, to feel empathy, to communicate nuance and emotion. These capabilities weren't just useful for survival. They were the foundation of what made us human. Every aspect of prehistoric social organization, from the optimal band size to the care of elders to the exchange networks spanning continents, all of it demonstrates the same basic truth. We survived because we worked together, because we cared for each other, because we built communities that were stronger than any individual could ever be. And that truth, forged in the desperate millennia of the bottleneck and refined through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, is still written into our DNA today. Something changed around 40,000 years ago. Something profound. Your ancestors had been surviving for hundreds of thousands of years, making tools, hunting, raising families, but they weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating things that served no practical purpose for survival, things that existed purely to communicate ideas, emotions, experiences that couldn't be expressed any other way. They were making art. Picture this. You're deep inside a cave in what's now southern France. The entrance is half a mile behind you. You're carrying a crude torch, animal fat burning on a bundle of dried grass. The flickering light barely penetrates the absolute darkness around you. Your heart is pounding. Not from fear exactly, but from anticipation. You're about to do something important, something sacred. You've been preparing for weeks, collecting ochre, that iron-rich red pigment that your people have been using for generations, grinding it into powder, mixing it with animal fat and maybe some plant resins to create paint. You've tested it on rocks near your camp. But this is different. You're going to paint on the sacred walls. the place where your ancestors painted, where the spirits live. You reach the chamber. It's massive, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above you, and covering the walls, rendered in ochre and charcoal and manganese dioxide, are animals. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Horses with flowing manes, massive aurochs, the wild cattle that your father hunted, lions stalking across the rock face with such grace that they seem ready to leap into the firelight. These aren't crude stick figures. These aren't the doodles of bored primitives. These are sophisticated artistic works created by people who understood perspective, movement, proportion. Who knew how to use the natural contours of the cave wall to create the illusion of three-dimensional form? Who could capture the essence of an animal in a few confident strokes? You add your contribution. Maybe it's another horse. Maybe it's your handprint, your palm pressed against the cold stone while you blow ochre powder around it, creating a negative image that will last 30,000 years. A signature that says, I was here, I existed, I mattered, but why? That's the question that has puzzled archaeologists since the first cave paintings were discovered. Why would your ancestors, people who struggle daily just to survive, invest enormous time and resources in creating art deep underground where almost no one would see it? The practical answer doesn't make sense. These paintings aren't in the inhabited parts of caves. They're not decorating living spaces. They're deep in the earth, in chambers that are difficult and sometimes dangerous to reach. Some are in passages so narrow you have to crawl. Others are high on chamber walls, requiring scaffolding to access. Creating them required planning and resources. Someone had to gather the pigments, some of which came from sources dozens of miles away. Someone had to prepare them, mixing binders and testing colours. Someone had to carry torches deep into the earth, maintaining light sources, for hours or even days while the work was completed. And these weren't individual efforts. Analysis of the painting shows multiple hands at work, different artists contributing to the same compositions over time, sometimes over centuries, generations of painters returning to the same sacred chambers, adding their visions to those of their ancestors. So what were they doing? What drove them into the darkness to create these masterpieces? Some researchers think the caves were ritual spaces, places where young hunters went to learn about the animals they would hunt, where shamans performed ceremonies to ensure successful hunts, where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world became thin enough to cross. The animals painted on cave walls aren't random, they're selective. In most caves, horses and bison dominate, even though archaeological evidence shows people were eating a much wider variety of animals. The painters were choosing specific subjects that meant something important to them. And they weren't just painting prey animals, they painted predators too. Cave lions, cave bears, animals that competed with humans for food and shelter. Animals that could kill you if you weren't careful. Maybe painting them was a way to understand them, to capture their power, to show respect for their place in the world. Then there are the abstract symbols. These are even more mysterious than the animal paintings. Dots and lines, grids and zigzags, geometric patterns that appear in caves across Europe and even in Africa and Asia. Some of these symbols are remarkably consistent. These same designs appearing in caves thousands of miles apart, suggesting they meant something specific. Something that was widely understood across vast distances and time periods. Could these be early writing? Probably not in the sense we understand it, but they were definitely symbolic communication, ideas being expressed in visual form, concepts too complex or too important to convey through spoken language alone. And the handprints appear everywhere. Sometimes isolated, sometimes in clusters, red hands, black hands, positive prints where the hand was dipped in paint and pressed to the wall, Negative prints where paint was blown around the hand, adults' hands, children's hands, hands with missing fingers, whether from injury or intentional amputation in some kind of ritual. These weren't decorative, these were deeply personal. Each handprint was an individual saying, I exist. I am part of this. I belong to this community and to this sacred space. Some researchers have identified specific individuals across multiple caves, the same hand appearing in different locations, suggesting people were travelling significant distances to participate in these rituals. But art wasn't confined to cave walls. Your ancestors were decorating themselves, their clothes, their tools. Archaeological sites from 100,000 years ago show evidence of personal ornamentation, pierced shells that were worn as beads, animal teeth drilled for stringing, pieces of ochre shaped like crayons worn smooth from use, probably for body painting. By 40,000 years ago, this practice had become universal. Every human culture was creating personal ornaments, beads made from shells, stones, bones, teeth, pendants carved with intricate designs, clothing decorated with rows of ivory beads, each one requiring hours of work to create. This wasn't vanity. This was communication. The ornaments people wore announced their identity, their status, their affiliations. They told stories about who you were and where you came from. They were wearable symbols of connection to family, community, ancestors, and they were making music. This might be the most remarkable discovery. Bone flutes that are 40,000 years old, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory, with carefully drilled finger holes that produce specific notes. These aren't simple whistles. These are sophisticated musical instruments designed to play melodies. Analysis of the fingerhole spacing shows the makers understood acoustics. They knew how to create specific intervals. They were composing music, not just making noise. And where there are musical instruments, there's probably singing, dancing, rhythmic ceremonies that brought communities together in shared experience. Some sites show evidence of percussion instruments too. Rocks with wear patterns suggesting they were struck repeatedly. Mammoth bones that produce different tones when hit with clubs. Your ancestors were creating orchestras, combining instruments to produce complex soundscapes. Imagine the scene. A summer gathering where multiple bands have come together. Maybe 100 people, maybe more. The largest assembly of humans some of them have seen in their entire lives. As darkness falls, the music begins. Flutes playing haunting melodies. Drums pounding out rhythms that sync with your heartbeat. Voices raised in song, telling stories of ancestors and heroes and the animals that sustain your people. This is what makes us human, not tool use. Lots of animals use tools. Not even language exactly, though language is part of it. What makes us human is this need to create shared meaning. To take our internal experiences and make them external. To build connections with other people through art and music and ritual. And then there were the burials. From around 100,000 years ago, we start seeing intentional burial of the dead. Not just disposal of bodies, but careful placement. Bodies positioned in specific ways, sometimes flexed, knees drawn up as if sleeping, sometimes extended, laid out with arms at their sides, and grave goods, objects placed with the dead, stone tools, obviously useful in life but now given to someone who can't use them, jewellery, the personal ornaments that announced identity, ochre, sprinkled over the body or placed in pouches beside it, animal bones, sometimes from species that weren't normally eaten, flowers, we think. Pollen analysis from one Neanderthal burial suggests the body was laid on a bed of woven branches and covered with flowers. This tells us something profound. Your ancestors believed death wasn't the end. Not exactly. They were preparing the dead for some kind of journey, giving them tools and ornaments and offerings for whatever came next. They had developed concepts of an afterlife, a spirit world, something beyond the immediate physical reality they could see and touch. The earliest burials are simple, but over time they become more elaborate. By 30,000 years ago, some burials are spectacularly complex. Bodies adorned with thousands of beads, weapons and tools of exceptional quality, evidence of ceremonies involving dozens of people. These weren't just funerals. These were statements about status, power, connection. And then there are the Venus figurines, small carved statues of women found across Europe and Asia. They're remarkably consistent in style despite being created by different groups thousands of miles apart. Exaggerated breasts, hips, bellies, detailed rendering of hair or headdresses, but faces that are often featureless, smooth and blank. What do they mean? Archaeologists have been arguing about this for over a century. Are they fertility symbols? Representations of mother goddesses? Portraits of real women? Self-portraits created by women looking down at their own bodies? Something else entirely? We don't know. We probably can't know. But what's certain is that they mattered. They were important enough that people across vast distances were creating them. Important enough that they were sometimes carried long distances from where they were made. Important enough that they were occasionally placed in burials or deposited in caves alongside the painted animals. They represent abstract thinking, the ability to create symbolic representations of concepts, not just copying what you see, but expressing ideas that exist only in your mind. This is the cognitive revolution, the moment when human consciousness became fully modern. Because all of this, the art and music and ritual and symbolism, it's evidence of something remarkable. Your ancestors were telling stories, stories that couldn't be captured in words alone, so they painted them on walls and carved them in stone and sang them into the darkness around their fires. They were creating oral traditions, bodies of knowledge passed down through generations, not just practical information about where to find water or how to make tools, but stories about who they were, where they came from, what it meant to be human. These stories don't survive. Language doesn't fossilize. But the evidence of storytelling is everywhere. The consistent cave art motifs suggest shared narratives. The burial practices imply beliefs about death and spirits. The personal ornaments indicate complex social identities that needed to be explained and understood. And here's what's most remarkable. This creative explosion, this birth of art and ritual and symbolic expression, it happened more or less simultaneously across the entire human world. In Europe and Africa and Asia, different groups separated by thousands of miles were all developing similar cultural practices at roughly the same time. This suggests it wasn't a lucky accident. It wasn't one genius inventor teaching others. It was something deeper, something in human cognition that had been building for hundreds of thousands of years that finally reached a threshold. The brain capacity was there. The social structures were in place. The population density was high enough to support specialists, people who could focus on creating art rather than just surviving. And once it began, there was no going back. Every human society from that point forward has created art. Every culture has developed rituals. Every people has told stories about themselves and their place in the cosmos. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities. They're how we make sense of a confusing world, how we find meaning in the brief span between birth and death. Your ancestors weren't primitive, they were us, fully modern humans with the same capacity for wonder, creativity and transcendence that we have today. They looked at the world and didn't just see resources to exploit. They saw beauty worth capturing, mystery worth exploring, experiences worth sharing across generations. They were creating culture, and in doing so they were creating the foundation for everything that would come after. cities and agriculture and writing and technology, all of it built on that fundamental human need to express what's inside us, to make the invisible visible, to connect with others through shared symbols and stories and songs. But they were also still struggling to survive in a harsh world, and as populations grew and resources became scarce, that world was about to get even harsher. You've probably heard the story 1,000 times. Prehistoric life was nasty, brutish, and short. Cave people barely made it to 30 before dying from infected wounds, rotten teeth, or getting trampled by mammoths. The whole species limping along until agriculture and modern medicine finally saved us from our miserable evolutionary fate. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. The skeletal evidence tells a completely different story, and it's far more interesting than the myth. Let's start with the big one: lifespan. Yes, average life expectancy in prehistoric populations was low, somewhere between 25 and 35 years depending on the group and time period. But here's what that number actually means. It doesn't mean everyone died at 30. It means that when you average in all the deaths, infant mortality pulls the number way down, and infant mortality was high, very high, probably somewhere between 20 and 40% of children died before their 5th birthday. That's devastating. That's every parent's worst nightmare happening to almost half of all families. But if you survived those first dangerous years, your prospects change dramatically. Skeletal analysis of prehistoric populations shows something remarkable. Individuals who made it past childhood frequently lived into their 50s, 60s, and even 70s. We have Neanderthal skeletons showing severe arthritis in elderly individuals. We have Homo erectus fossils with healed injuries that would have required months of care, indicating individuals survived well into old age. We have evidence of prehistoric humans with completely worn-down teeth, the kind of wear that only happens after decades of use. These weren't rare exceptions. They were common enough that every prehistoric band probably had elders, individuals who had accumulated 40, 50, 60 years of knowledge about where to find food, which plants were medicinal, how to predict weather patterns, where animals migrated. These elders were living libraries. Their survival into old age wasn't just possible, it was evolutionarily advantageous. Groups with experienced elders survived better than groups without them. But that doesn't mean life was easy. The same skeletons that show longevity also show the brutal toll that prehistoric life took on the body. Arthritis was incredibly common, especially in joints that saw heavy use: knees, hips, shoulders, spines, all showing the characteristic bone changes that come from decades of hard physical labour. These people were walking miles every day, carrying heavy loads, kneeling to process hides, squatting for hours while making tools. Their bodies bore the marks of constant, demanding physical work. Dental problems were surprisingly variable. Some prehistoric populations had remarkably good teeth, better than many modern populations. Others show evidence of severe dental disease, abscesses, tooth loss. The difference seems to come down to diet. Groups with diverse diets, including lots of fibrous plants, had teeth that were worn but healthy. Groups that relied heavily on processed or cooked foods, or those that went through periods of nutritional stress, show more dental pathologies. But here's what's interesting. Even with dental problems, prehistoric people often survived for years after major tooth loss. We have skulls showing completely resorbed tooth sockets, indicating the person lived for a decade or more after losing multiple teeth. They adapted. They changed their diet, relied on softer foods, let other group members do the heavy chewing and share the results. Injuries were everywhere in the fossil record: broken bones, healed fractures, damaged joints. But what's remarkable isn't the injuries themselves, it's how many of them healed. We have Neanderthal skeletons showing fractured arms that healed at odd angles, indicating the individual survived months of disability, while the bone knitted back together. We have Homo heidelbergensis fossils with healed skull fractures. We have evidence of broken legs that healed well enough for the person to walk again, hunt again, survive for years after the injury. This tells us something profound. These people were caring for their injured. A broken leg in the wild is a death sentence unless someone brings you food and water, protects you from predators, keeps you warm. The fact that so many prehistoric humans survived major injuries means they had social support systems. They had health care, even if it was primitive by modern standards. And sometimes it wasn't primitive at all. The archaeological evidence includes examples of what might be the world's oldest surgery: trepanation, deliberate drilling or scraping of holes in the skull. We have prehistoric skulls from multiple continents showing this procedure. And here's the shocking part. Many of them survived. We can tell because the bone shows evidence of healing around the hole. The person lived for months or years after someone took a sharp stone and cut through their skull. Why would they do this? We don't know for certain. Maybe they were trying to relieve pressure from head injuries. Maybe they thought it would cure headaches, seizures, mental illness. Maybe it was ritual. But the fact that they attempted it at all, and that patients often survived, tells us prehistoric people had some understanding of anatomy and surgical technique. They knew you could cut into the body and the person might live. They had developed procedures for doing this safely, or at least safely enough that survival was possible. Plant medicine was almost certainly widespread, though it leaves less direct evidence. We know this partly from skeletal analysis. Neanderthal teeth show traces of yarrow and chamomile, plants with no nutritional value but well-known medicinal properties. These weren't food, they were medicine. We also know it from genetics. Modern human populations carry genetic variants that help process plant toxins, adaptations that only make sense if our ancestors were regularly consuming bitter, potentially dangerous plants. They were experimenting with plant medicine, learning through trial and error which plants could reduce pain, fight infection, induce sleep, or ease digestive problems. This knowledge was probably passed down through generations, the healer in each group learning from the previous healer, building up a pharmacopoeia of effective remedies. Most of this knowledge was lost when those lineages died out, but some of it survived. Many traditional medicines used by modern hunter-gatherer groups are genuinely effective. They work because they are the result of thousands of years of experimentation and refinement. Childbirth was dangerous. There's no way around this fact. Pelvic bones from prehistoric women show the same adaptations modern women have for giving birth, which means they face the same challenges. Human babies have unusually large heads relative to their mother's pelvic opening. Birth is difficult, painful, and risky. Without modern medical intervention, maybe 1 to 2% of births result in the mother's death. Over a lifetime of multiple pregnancies, this adds up. Childbirth was probably one of the leading causes of death for prehistoric women, but here's where social support came in again. Evidence suggests prehistoric births weren't solitary events. Experienced women likely assisted, providing physical help, emotional support, and practical knowledge. They knew positioning techniques to ease labor. They knew when to intervene and when to wait. They had probably learned to deal with common complications. The survival of so many women through multiple births suggests they had developed effective birthing practices. Infant mortality remained high despite these efforts. Infections, birth defects, accidents, nutritional deficiencies all took a terrible toll on young children. But the ones who survived that dangerous early period often grew into remarkably healthy adults. Their diet, when resources were available, was excellent. Varied, nutritious, rich in protein, vitamins, and minerals. Skeletal analysis shows prehistoric hunter-gatherers had strong, dense bones. good height for their genetic background, well-developed musculature. When there was enough food, their bodies thrived. The problems came during periods of scarcity. Bones from some prehistoric individuals show what are called Harris lines, stress markers that form when growth is interrupted by starvation or severe illness. These lines tell us that periodic famine was a real threat. Not constant, but recurring often enough that most individuals experienced at least one severe nutritional crisis during their growth years. Compared to what came later, though, prehistoric hunter-gatherers were remarkably healthy. When agriculture developed around 10,000 years ago, human health took a dramatic turn for the worse. Early agricultural populations show decreased height, increased dental disease, more infectious diseases, higher rates of nutritional deficiencies. Their bones are less dense, their teeth more damaged, their skeletal markers of stress more severe. Why? Because agriculture created concentrated populations living in permanent settlements. Disease spread faster. Reliance on a few staple crops created nutritional deficiencies. Hard agricultural labour created new patterns of skeletal stress. For the first few thousand years after agriculture developed, being a farmer was actually worse for your health than being a hunter-gatherer. Prehistoric people were physically stronger than most modern humans. They had to be. Daily life required constant physical exertion, walking miles to find food, carrying heavy loads back to camp, processing animal carcasses, working hides, making tools, building shelters. Every task was manual labour. Their bodies adapted. They developed powerful muscles, robust skeletons, efficient cardiovascular systems. They were endurance athletes by necessity. But this came at a cost. Joint damage accumulated over decades. Spinal problems were common, especially in older individuals. Muscle and tendon injuries probably occurred regularly, though these don't preserve in the fossil record. The body can only take so much punishment before it starts breaking down. The psychological toll is harder to measure, but it was real. Living with constant uncertainty about food. Watching children die from illnesses you couldn't prevent. Suffering through injuries with nothing but primitive pain management. The stress of knowing that a broken bone or serious infection could easily be a death sentence. Mental health challenges almost certainly existed, though we have no direct evidence. Depression, anxiety, trauma from violence or losses. The human brain hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. If we're capable of these experiences now, they were too. Yet despite all these challenges, prehistoric humans not only survived, they thrived. They developed sophisticated medical knowledge. They cared for their sick and injured. They accumulated healing wisdom and passed it down through generations. They created social systems that protected vulnerable members. They proved that even without hospitals, antibiotics, or surgery, human beings could live long, relatively healthy lives. The evidence is written in their bones, healed fractures, arthritic joints that continued functioning for decades, toothless elderly individuals who survived years after losing their teeth, skulls with surgical holes that closed over as the patient recovered. Every skeleton tells a story of resilience, of bodies that were pushed to their limits and somehow kept going, of communities that cared for their members even when it cost them dearly. These weren't superhuman, they were just human. Facing challenges we can barely imagine with nothing but stone tools, plant medicine, and each other. And somehow, incredibly, that was enough. Not always, not for everyone. The infant graves and traumatic injuries remind us that prehistoric life was genuinely dangerous. But more often than you'd think, it was enough. Enough to heal, enough to survive, enough to grow old and pass wisdom to the next generation. We carry that resilience in our bodies today. Every healed bone, every recovered illness, Every survival story is an echo of what our ancestors endured for hundreds of thousands of years. They were tougher than we imagine, smarter than we credit them for, and far more capable of caring for each other than the myths suggest. The prehistoric body wasn't weak. It was adapted for survival in ways our modern bodies have forgotten, and the prehistoric mind had already figured out the most important medical truth. That healing isn't just about medicine. It's about community, care, and the determination to keep living even when everything hurts. Let's step inside an actual day. Not a dramatic hunt, not a crisis, just an ordinary Tuesday 40,000 years ago. If Tuesday had existed, which it didn't, because your ancestors hadn't invented weeks yet, or Tuesdays, the first thing you need to understand is that time worked differently. Not physically, the Earth was still rotating at the same speed, but psychologically, experientially, time was something else entirely. There were no clocks, no schedules, no concept of being late. Time was measured by the sun's position, the length of shadows, the feeling in your stomach that said you were hungry. Your ancestors lived in what anthropologists call task time, rather than clock time. You did things when they needed doing, and you stopped when they were done, or when darkness made continuing impossible. Simple, brutal, honest. Dawn came slowly in the Paleolithic. No alarm clocks, no sudden jarring transitions from sleep to wakefulness. Your body woke when light levels increased enough to trigger your circadian rhythms. Maybe you'd been half aware for an hour already, listening to the sounds of the world waking up around you. Birds beginning their morning calls, the rustle of small animals moving through nearby vegetation. Perhaps the distant sound of larger game moving to watering holes. The first person awake was usually whoever had drawn the last firewatch shift. Because letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Starting fire from scratch was possible. Your people had mastered it thousands of years earlier, but it was difficult, time-consuming, and not something you wanted to do every morning when you could simply keep embers alive through the night. So someone stayed awake, or at least drowsily aware, feeding small amounts of fuel to keep the coals glowing until morning. As dawn light filtered into your shelter, cave, rock overhang, or constructed hut, the fire tender would start building up the flames. Not a roaring bonfire, but a controlled, efficient fire sized appropriately for the tasks ahead. Morning fires were for warmth and cooking, not signalling or defense. The smoke would drift up and out, carrying with it the scent that would become, over thousands of years, hardwired into human psychology as the smell of safety and home. Others would wake gradually. Children first, usually. Their metabolisms running hot, their bodies demanding fuel after a night's growth. Then adults, rolling out of sleeping arrangements that were surprisingly sophisticated. You weren't just lying on cold ground. Archaeological evidence shows Paleolithic people used layers of grass, reeds, and animal hides to create insulation from the earth. Some groups even created raised sleeping platforms. They understood thermal dynamics in a practical, experiential way that would make modern camping enthusiasts jealous. Morning routines existed, but they weren't what you'd recognize. No brushing teeth, though some groups probably used fibrous plant materials to clean debris from their mouths. No showers, though many Paleolithic groups likely bathed regularly in rivers, lakes, or natural pools when weather permitted. Personal hygiene was simpler, but not absent. Your ancestors understood that parasites were bad, that infections were dangerous, that some level of cleanliness improved comfort and health. What happened next depended entirely on the season, and not just which season, but how that season was progressing, what resources were currently available, what the weather looked like, what phase the moon was in, how long it had been since the last successful hunt. Paleolithic life was a constant negotiation with uncertainty. In summer, mornings might be dedicated to foraging. Small groups, usually women and children with perhaps a few men, would spread out across familiar territories gathering plant foods. This wasn't casual berry picking. This was systematic exploitation of known resources by experts who could identify hundreds of plant species, knew their seasonal availability, understood which parts were edible and which were toxic, and could process them into forms that maximized nutritional value and storage potential. A skilled Paleolithic forager could gather several thousand calories in a few hours of work: nuts, seeds, roots, tubers, fruits, leaves, bark, insects. Every environment offered dozens of food sources to those who knew where to look, and your ancestors definitely knew where to look. They had been learning these landscapes for generations, building mental maps of resource locations that were passed down through families like precious heirlooms. The men who weren't foraging might be working on tools, not necessarily hunting. Actual hunting didn't happen every day. But maintaining equipment, crafting new implements, processing materials. A good stone blade could take hours to make properly. Spear shafts needed to be cut, dried, straightened over fire, fitted with points, secured with bindings made from sinew or plant fibers. Each tool represented accumulated knowledge spanning thousands of years. Every strike of stone on stone, every choice of material and technique embodied wisdom passed down through countless generations. Or maybe they were processing resources from a previous hunt. Scraping hides took days of work. You had to remove all the fat and tissue, stretch the hide, treat it with animal brains or other materials to keep it supple, smoke it to preserve it. A single deer hide might represent 20 hours of labor spread across a week, but that hide would become clothing, shelter materials, bindings, containers. Everything was used, nothing wasted, because waste meant more work later. Children were everywhere during these morning activities, not separated into age-segregated groups like modern kids, but integrated into adult work, watching, imitating, learning through participation. A 5-year-old might be gathering firewood or easy-to-identify plant foods. A 10-year-old could be practicing with child-sized hunting weapons or helping process hides. A teenager might be fully participating in adult activities, their skills developing rapidly through constant observation and practice. This was education, but it looked nothing like school. No formal instruction, no lectures, no tests. Just constant immersion in the skills necessary for survival. Children learned the same way all young mammals learn, through play that gradually transformed into practical ability. Those hunting games with toy spears became actual hunting skills. That practice with stone tools became real tool-making capability. By midday, activity shifted. In hot weather, this was rest time. Intense physical labor during the hottest hours was inefficient and dangerous. So many Paleolithic groups would return to shelters, rest in shade, engage in social activities. This is when tool-making often happened. Fine detail work done in the cooler, more comfortable environment of a shaded area. This is when stories were told, knowledge shared, social bonds maintained. And here's something that surprises most people. Your Paleolithic ancestors probably had more leisure time than any humans who came after them until the modern industrial era. Hunter-gatherers typically work about 15 to 20 hours per week on subsistence activities. That's it. The rest of the time is socializing, playing, resting, creating art, engaging in rituals. Early farmers, by contrast, worked 60 to 80-hour weeks and had less diverse diets. Agriculture was not an upgrade in lifestyle. It was a trap that increased population density at the cost of individual welfare. But your Paleolithic ancestors hadn't fallen into that trap yet. They had time to sit and talk, time to work on decorative items that served no survival purpose, time to play music on bone flutes or drums, time to create art on cave walls or portable objects, time to be human in ways that went beyond mere survival. Afternoon brought another round of activities, maybe fishing if the group lived near water, maybe checking trap lines, maybe scouting for game, maybe just more foraging if resources needed replenishing. The pace was relaxed but purposeful. Nobody was rushing, but nothing was being neglected either. Tasks got done because not doing them had obvious, immediate consequences. Late afternoon was often teaching time. Elder members of the group would share knowledge that couldn't be learned through observation alone. Which plants were poisonous but useful as medicines? How to read animal tracks and interpret behaviour? Where to find water sources during dry seasons? How to predict weather changes from cloud patterns and wind shifts? This was the oral tradition in action, the slow accumulation and transfer of survival knowledge that made human culture possible. As evening approached, everyone would begin returning to the main camp or shelter. The fire would be built up again, larger now, both for cooking and for the social gathering that was about to happen. Because evening was special. Evening was when the band came together as a complete social unit. Cooking happened in many ways. Roasting meat directly on coals, boiling water in containers using hot stones, baking foods wrapped in leaves in earth ovens. Your ancestors were sophisticated cooks with techniques refined over millennia. They understood flavour combinations, cooking times, how to render fats, how to extract maximum nutrition from every food source. This wasn't primitive survival eating. This was cuisine, adapted to available ingredients but no less complex than any other food tradition. As darkness fell, something magical happened. The fire became the centre of the social universe. People arranged themselves around it in patterns that reflected social relationships and hierarchies. Stories began. Not just entertainment, though they certainly entertained. These stories were vehicles for transmitting crucial information. Lessons about dangers learned by others, maps of territory encoded in narrative, histories of the group's movements and relationships, religious and spiritual knowledge, everything important that couldn't be written down because writing wouldn't be invented for another 35,000 years, had to be memorized and transmitted through story. Children would be drifting towards sleep now, their bellies full, their bodies exhausted from a day of activity. They'd be lying against parents or older siblings, listening to the adult conversations with half-closed eyes, absorbing information even as they slip toward unconsciousness. No separation of children into separate sleeping areas. The band slept together, in a communal arrangement that provided both warmth and security. As the fire burned lower, conversation would quiet. Someone would bank the coals for the night, covering them with ash to slow combustion while keeping them alive until morning. The night watch would be arranged, and slowly the band would settle into sleep. But before unconsciousness claimed them, there would be moments of wonder. Looking up through whatever opening existed in their shelter, or from outside on clear nights, seeing stars in numbers that modern humans living under light-polluted skies can barely imagine. The Milky Way blazing across the sky like a river of light, planets visible as steady, bright points, occasional meteors streaking across the darkness, the moon in whatever phase it currently occupied, its light casting shadows and making night travel possible when necessary. Your ancestors knew those skies intimately. They tracked celestial movements, predicted lunar cycles, used stars for navigation. They created stories to explain what they saw, mythologies that would evolve over millennia into the constellation systems we still use today. They felt both tiny beneath that cosmic vastness and connected to it in ways that modern urban humans have largely lost. This was a day in the Paleolithic, not desperate struggle, not constant danger, just normal life. Work and rest, teaching and learning, community and solitude, all flowing together in natural rhythms dictated by light and dark, seasons and resources, hunger and satisfaction. No clocks, no schedules, no artificial divisions of time, just the eternal dance of human adaptation to the natural world. Tomorrow would bring similar patterns with infinite variations, and the day after that, and the day after that, for thousands of years, until everything changed. So here we are, at the end of our journey into the lives of our prehistoric ancestors. We've walked with them from dawn to dusk, watched them hunt and gather, seen them create art in flickering firelight, and witnessed them care for their sick and bury their dead. We've explored their shelters, examined their tools, and glimpsed the beginnings of everything that makes us human. But what does it all mean? What connects us to these people who lived tens of thousands of years ago? Everything, actually. Think about what we've discovered. Those prehistoric humans weren't brutish, simple-minded survivors just scraping by. They were innovators, problem solvers, artists. They developed technologies that let them thrive in environments that would kill most of us within days. They created social bonds strong enough to keep communities alive through ice ages and droughts. They looked at the world around them and didn't just see resources. They saw meaning, beauty, stories worth painting on cave walls. Every time you solve a problem creatively, you're using mental tools they invented. Every time you gather with family and friends, you're enacting social patterns they established. Every time you feel wonder at a sunset or find meaning in a piece of art, you're experiencing emotions they felt while watching the same sun set over a very different world. The thread runs unbroken from them to us. We're not separate from our caveman ancestors. We are them, just with different tools and different problems. Consider what daily life meant for them. Waking up each morning with no guarantee of finding food. Watching the horizon for weather changes that could mean survival or death. Depending absolutely on the people around you, knowing that alone you'd never make it. But together you might thrive. These weren't abstract concepts. This was reality every single day. And yet they found time for beauty. They carved figurines. They painted animals with such skill that artists today study them in awe. They made music from bone flutes. They adorned their bodies with ochre and shells. They told stories around fires that we'll never hear, but whose echoes live in every story we tell today. They weren't just surviving. They were living, finding joy and meaning in a world far harsher than anything most of us will ever experience. That's the legacy that matters most. Not the specific tools or techniques, though those are fascinating, but the attitude, the determination to not just endure, but to create, to not just exist, but to find wonder, to not just survive alone, but to build communities that could weather any storm. We carry their genes. Every single person alive today is descended from people who survived impossible odds, who lived through climate disasters that nearly destroyed our species, who kept going when everything said to give up, who preserved knowledge across generations, passing it hand to hand through thousands of years. You are the product of the most successful survivors in human history. And here's what's truly remarkable. We're still learning their story. Every year, new discoveries reshape our understanding of prehistoric life. Cave paintings are found in places we never expected. DNA analysis reveals connections we never imagined. Archaeological techniques get more sophisticated, letting us see details of daily life that previous generations of researchers could never access. The picture keeps getting richer, more complex, more human. We used to think Neanderthals were primitive brutes. Now we know they were caring people who nursed their sick and mourned their dead. We thought symbolic thinking was recent. Now we find ochre engravings from hundreds of thousands of years ago, Each discovery makes our ancestors more relatable, more real. The story isn't finished. There are still caves unexplored, sites unexcavated, questions unanswered. Somewhere out there, buried in sediment or hidden in remote valleys, are artifacts and remains that will revolutionize how we understand human prehistory. The next great discovery could happen tomorrow, but for tonight we can rest with what we know, that our ancestors lived full, meaningful lives, that they loved their children and cared for their elders, that they created beauty and sought understanding, that they were fundamentally, recognizably human in ways that transcend the vast gulf of time separating us. Before we drift off, if you've enjoyed this journey into our prehistoric past, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I love hearing from you all. If you'd like to support the channel, there's an optional YouTube membership available, but please, absolutely no pressure. The important thing is that you're here, learning and wondering alongside me. Thank you for spending this time exploring the world of our ancient ancestors, for being curious about where we came from and who we used to be. That curiosity, that desire to understand, that's part of the legacy too. Our ancestors looked at the world and asked questions. You're doing exactly the same thing. Rest well tonight, knowing you carry within you the strength of countless generations who survived everything the world could throw at them. Let their resilience comfort you, let their creativity inspire your dreams. Sleep peacefully, fellow descendants of the survivors. Until next time.